At the elegant Christmas party, decorated with glittering lights and expensive champagne, a pregnant wife stood trembling as her husband's mistress poured dirty water over her designer maternity dress, while the entire room watched in stunned silence. Her husband and his entire family erupted in cruel laughter, their mockery echoing through the marble halls as she clutched the divorce papers with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face while mascara traced dark rivers down her cheeks. What none of them knew, not her sneering husband, not his cackling family, not even the smirking mistress adjusting her red cocktail dress, was that this humiliated woman signing those papers with trembling fingers was actually a trillionaire's daughter, carefully hidden from the world for 28 years. The pen hovered over the signature line as something shifted in her tear-filled eyes, a dangerous calm replacing the hurt, a transformation so subtle yet so powerful that the mistress's triumphant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Would this pregnant wife simply walk away into the snowy Christmas night, accepting defeat and public humiliation, or would what she did next shock them all so completely that devastation would be the only word left to describe their fate? The Ashford Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with 1,000 crystal chandeliers, each one reflecting the carefully curated wealth of New York's upper middle class. On Christmas Eve, Victoria Hayes stood near the dessert table, her 6-month pregnancy barely concealed beneath an elegant emerald dress that had cost her 3 months of savings from her teaching salary. But her husband Daniel hadn't noticed. He never noticed anymore. Across the room, Daniel Hayes commanded attention as he always did, his arm draped possessively around Brittany Monroe's waist, while his business associates congratulated him on the upcoming merger with Monroe Industries. Victoria watched her husband of 4 years laugh at something Brittany whispered in his ear, the same ear where she'd whispered, "I love you," 1,000 times during their courtship, back when he'd been a struggling marketing associate and she'd believed in fairy tales. What Victoria remembered now, standing alone, with one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly, was the night they'd met at a community college fundraiser 7 years ago. Daniel had spilled coffee on her favorite book, a worn copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and spent the entire evening apologizing, buying her dinner, promising to replace it. She'd fallen for his earnestness, his ambition, his declarations that he wanted a simple life with someone who valued love over money. She'd believed him when he'd proposed in that tiny apartment, promising that together they'd build something real, something that mattered more than wealth or status, but that Daniel had disappeared the moment his career took off 3 years ago. This Daniel, the one currently whispering intimately with his mistress at their company's Christmas party, was a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Victoria, darling, you look positively radiant." Daniel's mother, Patricia Hayes, materialized beside her with a champagne flute in hand and contempt in her eyes. "Though I must say that dress is quite optimistic for your current condition. Brittany mentioned that emerald makes women look sallow. She has such impeccable taste, doesn't she?" Victoria's fingers tightened around her sparkling water glass. Patricia had never forgiven her son for marrying a nobody instead of someone from their social circle, conveniently forgetting that the Hayes family had only acquired their modest wealth 2 generations ago through Patricia's grandfather's hardware store chain. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria, but she'd learned long ago that pointing out hypocrisy to people who benefited from it was an exercise in futility. "The dress was a gift," Victoria said quietly, thinking of the small package that had arrived last week from her father's assistant. She rarely accepted anything from her father, preferring to maintain the independence she'd fought so hard for, but something had compelled her to wear it tonight. Perhaps some part of her had known she'd need armor. "A gift? How lovely! From whom?" Patricia's eyes gleamed with malicious curiosity. Before Victoria could respond, Daniel's voice boomed across the ballroom, amplified by the microphone he'd commandeered from the DJ. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The room fell silent as 200 faces turned toward Daniel Hayes, standing on the small stage with Brittany beside him, her hand resting on his chest in a gesture of intimacy that made Victoria's stomach turn. She knew what was coming, had known for weeks, really, since she'd found the divorce papers hidden in his study, already filled out, just waiting for his signature and hers. "I have an announcement to make this Christmas Eve," Daniel continued, his voice carrying that practiced charm that had once made her heart flutter, but now only made it sink. "As many of you know, Hayes Marketing has been struggling to compete with larger firms. But tonight, I'm thrilled to announce that we're merging with Monroe Industries, securing our future and tripling our market value." Applause rippled through the crowd. Victoria remained frozen, watching her husband's face glow with triumph and greed, so different from the man who'd once told her that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. "But that's not the only change in my life," Daniel continued, his eyes finally finding Victoria's across the crowded room. Something cold and cruel glittered in their depths. "I'm also announcing that I'll be filing for divorce after the holidays, ending my marriage to Victoria Hayes." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Victoria felt the walls closing in, felt 200 pairs of eyes drilling into her, but she stood perfectly still, one hand on her belly where their daughter kicked, oblivious to the destruction of her parents' marriage. Brittany stepped forward, taking the microphone with practiced ease. "I know this seems sudden," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "but Daniel and I have fallen deeply in love. Sometimes the heart wants what it wants, and we can't apologize for finding happiness together." Victoria watched Brittany's performance with detached fascination, noting the way she emphasized certain words, the way she angled her body toward the society reporter she'd clearly invited to document this moment. This wasn't spontaneous. This was calculated, orchestrated, designed for maximum humiliation. "And honestly," Brittany continued, her mask slipping just slightly, "Daniel deserves someone who can match his ambition, someone who understands the world he's building, not some small-town teacher who shops at discount stores and drives a 10-year-old Honda." The laughter started with Daniel's brother, Marcus, a sharp bark that echoed through the marble halls. Then Patricia joined in, her tinkling laugh carrying notes of vindication. Within seconds, the entire Hayes family was laughing. Daniel's father, Richard, his sister Amanda, his cousins and aunts and uncles, all of them finding humor in Victoria's public humiliation. Victoria's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them back, refusing to give them the satisfaction. She thought about her father's warnings 7 years ago when she'd told him she wanted to marry Daniel without revealing her family's wealth. "You think you're testing his character," her father had said, disappointment heavy in his voice, "but you're really just testing yourself. And when this fails, because it will fail, Victoria, you'll have no one to blame but your own stubborn pride." She'd been so angry at him then, so certain that love could transcend money and status, that Daniel's feelings for her were pure because he didn't know she was James Morrison's daughter, heir to a business empire worth $3 trillion. She'd wanted to be loved for herself, not for her father's fortune, and she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for, a man who loved her when she had nothing and left her the moment someone wealthier appeared. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. "Victoria!" Brittany's voice cut through her thoughts. "We need your signature on the divorce papers. Daniel was kind enough to have them drawn up already. We'd like to make this official before the new year." Victoria looked up to find Brittany approaching, carrying an expensive leather folder that undoubtedly contained the legal documents that would end her marriage. Behind her, Daniel watched with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of impatience and contempt that twisted something deep in Victoria's chest. "The papers are very generous," Brittany continued, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she closed the distance between them. Daniel is offering you $50,000 in settlement, despite the fact that you brought nothing to the marriage. No assets, no connections, just debt from your student loans. You should be grateful he's being so charitable. $50,000. Victoria almost laughed at the absurdity. The watch her father had given her for her 21st birthday, currently locked in a safety deposit box she hadn't opened in years, was worth more than $50 million. The trust fund she'd refused to touch could buy Daniel's entire company with pocket change. The apartment building where she rented her modest one-bedroom was owned by her father's real estate division, though she'd never told anyone. But these people didn't know that. They saw what she'd wanted them to see, a simple teacher, a poor girl who'd married above her station, a nobody who should be grateful for whatever scraps they threw her. Brittany reached her, holding out the leather folder with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just sign here, Victoria. Make this easy on everyone. Victoria took the folder with trembling hands, her vision swimming with unshed tears. She could feel the weight of 200 stares, could hear the whispered speculations, could sense the collective judgment of a room full of people who decided her worth based on her salary and her car. Oh, how tragic, Patricia's voice carried clearly across the room. She's actually crying. Did she really think Daniel would stay with her forever? A man like my son needs a partner who can elevate him, not drag him down. More laughter. Victoria opened the folder, seeing her name typed next to Daniel's on the official documents. 7 years of love, 4 years of marriage, reduced to legal terminology and financial settlements. Her hand shook as she reached for the pen Brittany offered. Before you sign, Brittany said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, I should mention that Daniel and I will be announcing our engagement on New Year's Eve. Your daughter will have a stepmother who can actually provide for her, give her the life she deserves. Isn't that wonderful? Something cracked inside Victoria's chest, a hairline fracture that had been forming for months, finally splitting wide open. Her daughter. Brittany was talking about her unborn daughter, already planning to replace Victoria in every aspect of her child's life. The pen was inches from the paper when Brittany's phone rang. She glanced at it, irritation flickering across her face, but answered anyway. This is Brittany Monroe. Yes? What do you mean the merger is… what? Victoria watched Brittany's face, drain of color, watched her confident smile collapse into shock and confusion. Across the room, Daniel's phone buzzed insistently, then Patricia's, then Richard's. Within seconds, half the ballroom was checking their phones, their expressions shifting from amusement to bewilderment. That's impossible, Brittany whispered into her phone, but her voice carried in the sudden silence. Morrison Holdings can't just… they wouldn't… Morrison Holdings. Victoria's pen froze above the signature line. Daniel pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger. What's going on? Brittany, what's happening with the merger? It's cancelled, Brittany said, her voice hollow with disbelief. Morrison Holdings just bought Monroe Industries completely. They're dissolving the company, absorbing the assets. The merger with your firm is void. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Daniel's phone rang again, and Victoria watched his face cycle through confusion, denial, and dawning horror as he listened to whoever was on the other end. His business, his future, his carefully constructed empire, all of it crumbling in real time. That's not all, Brittany continued, staring at her phone screen as new messages flooded in. Morrison Holdings is also acquiring Hayes Marketing. They're offering to buy you out completely, Daniel, for pennies on the dollar. It says here they have evidence of financial irregularities, breach of contract, fraud. That's insane, Daniel shouted, but his voice cracked with panic. Who is doing this? Why would Morrison Holdings even notice a company our size? Victoria stood perfectly still, the unsigned divorce papers forgotten in her hands. She thought about the phone call she'd made 3 days ago, the first time she'd contacted her father in 4 years. She'd told him everything about Daniel's affair, about the divorce papers, about the mistress who'd been calling her at home to gloat. She hadn't asked for help. She never asked for help. But her father had listened in silence, and then he'd said something that had puzzled her at the time. "You've spent 7 years proving you don't need my money, Victoria. But you're still my daughter, and you're carrying my granddaughter. Let me show you what happens to people who hurt my family." She'd thought he meant lawyers, perhaps private investigators. She hadn't realized he meant total annihilation. A new commotion erupted near the ballroom entrance. Victoria looked up to see hotel security parting the crowd, making way for someone. The whispers grew louder, urgent, shocked. "Is that? It can't be. James Morrison, here?" Her father strode into the ballroom like a force of nature, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom suit worth more than everything in the room combined. At 72, James Morrison commanded the attention of presidents and kings, controlled industry that shaped global economics, and ruled a business empire that stretched across 6 continents. He was also, as Forbes had confirmed just last month, the world's first verified trillionaire, and he was walking directly toward Victoria. The ballroom fell into stunned silence as James Morrison stopped in front of his daughter, his eyes softening in a way that few people ever witnessed. "Hello, sweetheart," he said quietly, reaching out to touch her face with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation as the most ruthless businessman alive. "I'm sorry I'm late." Victoria's tears finally fell, but they were different now. Relief mixed with love, mixed with the complex emotions of a daughter who'd run from her father's protection only to find herself needing it desperately. "Dad," she whispered, "you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," James said firmly. Then he turned to face the room, his expression hardening into the mask that made Fortune 500 CEOs tremble. His eyes found Daniel, who stood frozen with his phone still pressed to his ear, his face ashen. "My daughter called me 3 days ago," James Morrison announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom. "For the first time in 4 years, she reached out to me. Do you know why? Because her husband," he pointed at Daniel with barely concealed contempt, "decided to humiliate her publicly while she's 6 months pregnant with his child. Because his mistress has been calling my daughter at all hours, describing in detail how she'll replace her. Because this man's entire family has spent years treating my Victoria like she's worthless." Patricia Hayes made a sound like a strangled gasp. James's eyes cut to her. "You laughed at my daughter tonight," he said coldly. "You mocked her dress, her car, her profession. You suggested she wasn't good enough for your son. Let me explain something to you, Mrs. Hayes. That emerald dress Victoria is wearing, it's a custom Valentino worth $200,000. I had it made for her last month. The 10-year-old Honda you all find so amusing, she drives it by choice, even though she has access to a fleet of vehicles worth more than your house. And her profession? My daughter has a PhD in educational psychology from Harvard, which she earned while volunteering at inner-city schools because she actually cares about making a difference." Victoria watched her former mother-in-law's face cycle through emotions, disbelief, horror, and finally, devastating recognition. Patricia's eyes dropped to the simple pendant Victoria always wore, the one she claimed was a family heirloom. It was a family heirloom, a flawless 50-carat yellow diamond that had belonged to Victoria's grandmother, worth approximately $40 million. "You're lying," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Victoria would have told me. We were married. She wouldn't..." "Wouldn't what?" James cut him off. "Wouldn't test whether you loved her for herself or her money. Wouldn't want to ensure your feelings were genuine. My daughter has a romantic streak, Mr. Hayes. She believed in love, in authenticity. She thought that by hiding her background, she'd find someone who valued her for who she is, not what she has." He paused, his expression turning glacial. She found you instead. Brittany had backed away, her triumphant smile long gone, replaced by dawning horror. The merger, she whispered. Monroe Industries. You destroyed my family's company because of this? I destroyed your family's company because you thought it was acceptable to pour dirty water on my pregnant daughter at a Christmas party, James said, his voice deadly quiet. Yes, Ms. Monroe, I know about your little stunt last week at the restaurant when you followed Victoria to lunch and accidentally spilled an entire pitcher of ice water on her while she was eating with colleagues. She didn't tell me, my security team did. They've been watching her since she got married, making sure she was safe, making sure she was happy. He turned back to Daniel, who had gone from pale to greenish. You signed a prenuptial agreement before your marriage, Mr. Hayes. Do you remember what it said? Daniel nodded mutely. It stated that in the event of divorce due to infidelity, the unfaithful party forfeits all assets acquired during the marriage and pays a penalty equal to 50% of their net worth to the faithful party, James recited from memory. You thought it was a standard document. You signed it without really reading it because you assumed Victoria had nothing to protect. But that prenuptial agreement was drawn up by my lawyers, and it's ironclad. Victoria watched her husband's face as the full weight of his situation crashed over him. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a hollow sadness for the death of the love she'd once believed in. Your business is being acquired as we speak, James continued. Your personal assets are being frozen pending investigation into the financial fraud my team discovered. Real fraud, by the way, not fabricated charges. You've been embezzling from your own company to fund your lifestyle and Brittany's expensive tastes. The evidence is already with the authorities. This is insane, Daniel said, but he was looking at Victoria now, seeing her for the first time. She's actually my daughter, James finished. Victoria Ann Morrison, and you had the privilege of being married to her for 4 years, during which time she supported your dreams, believed in your potential, and loved you unconditionally. All she asked in return was loyalty and respect. You couldn't even give her that. Brittany lunged forward suddenly, her composure completely shattered, and before anyone could react, she grabbed a champagne bucket filled with ice water from a nearby table. You manipulative bitch, she screamed, swinging the bucket toward Victoria. You played us all. You pretended to be poor while you were secretly rich, and now you're using Daddy's money to destroy us. The ice water arced through the air in slow motion, but it never reached Victoria. James Morrison moved with surprising speed for a man his age, stepping between Brittany and his daughter. The dirty water splashed across his expensive suit instead, ice cubes clattering against the marble floor. Security descended immediately, grabbing Brittany and pulling her away as she continued to scream obscenities. But James ignored her, turning to Victoria with concern. Are you all right? Is the baby— We're fine, Dad, Victoria said softly, placing a hand on his wet sleeve. Thank you. The divorce papers were still in her hands, unsigned. Victoria looked down at them, at Daniel's signature already in place, at the space waiting for hers. She thought about the woman she'd been when she'd married him. Young, naive, believing that love could overcome any obstacle. She thought about the woman she'd become, stronger, wiser, but still clinging to the hope that the man she'd married might still exist somewhere beneath the greed and ambition. He didn't. He never had. She'd been in love with potential, with promises, with the performance Daniel had given, because he'd thought she was his best option at the time. Victoria picked up the pen and signed her name with steady hands. The marriage was over, but she wasn't devastated. She was free. The settlement you offered was $50,000, James said to Daniel, who stood surrounded by his shocked family members. How generous. Victoria's counter-settlement, as stipulated by the prenuptial agreement, is 50% of your net worth. Once the criminal charges are settled and your debts are paid, I estimate that will be approximately negative $7 million. My daughter, however, is willing to be merciful. She'll waive the penalty if you sign over full custody of your daughter and agree never to contact either of them again." "You can't do this," Patricia Hayes said, but she was crying now, mascara streaming down her face just as Victoria's had earlier. "You can't just destroy our family because you laughed when your son humiliated his pregnant wife at Christmas," James finished. "Because you spent years making my daughter feel worthless? Because you threw a party to celebrate her divorce?" He shook his head. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm not destroying your family. Your son did that when he chose greed over love. I'm simply ensuring he faces consequences for his choices." Victoria watched Daniel sign the custody agreement with shaking hands. She watched Brittany being escorted from the ballroom by security. She watched the entire Hayes family slowly realize that their lives would never be the same, that crossing James Morrison's daughter had cost them everything they'd worked for. But she felt no joy in their downfall, only exhaustion and a deep, profound relief that it was over. "Let's go home, sweetheart," her father said gently, offering his arm. "Your mother is waiting. She's been frantic with worry." Victoria took his arm, turning away from Daniel and his family and the wreckage of her marriage. As they walked through the silent ballroom, guests parted like water, their earlier judgment replaced by shock and fear and the dawning realization that they'd witnessed something unprecedented. At the doorway, Victoria paused and looked back one final time. Daniel stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by his family but completely isolated, staring at the divorce papers in his hands as if they might somehow rewrite themselves. "I loved you," Victoria said quietly, knowing he couldn't hear her from this distance, saying it more for herself than him. "I really did. I hope someday you understand what you lost. Not the money. You never cared about me for money. But you lost the chance to be loved by someone who would have given you everything that mattered, and you traded it for things that matter not at all." Then she turned and walked out into the snowy Christmas night, her father's arm supporting her, heading toward a future where she would raise her daughter, surrounded by people who valued love over status, character over wealth, and family over everything else. Behind them, the Christmas party continued in shocked whispers and frantic phone calls, but Victoria didn't look back again. She was done with that chapter of her life, done with proving herself to people who'd already decided her worth based on superficial measures. The snow fell softly on Manhattan streets, covering the city in pristine white, and Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that her daughter would grow up knowing her worth. Hope that she would teach her child that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the strength of character and the depth of love. Hope that the scars from this marriage would heal into wisdom rather than bitterness. "Your mother wants to know if you'll come for Christmas dinner tomorrow," her father said as they reached his car, where a driver waited with an umbrella. "She's making your favorite honey-glazed ham with those ridiculous tiny potatoes she insists on making from scratch," Victoria finished, smiling through her tears. "I'll be there, Dad. We both will." She placed a hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick as if in agreement. James Morrison smiled, the ruthless businessman disappearing completely as he looked at his daughter with undisguised love and pride. "She's already strong, just like her mother, and she'll grow up knowing exactly how valuable she is, because we won't let her forget it." They drove away from the Ashford Hotel, leaving behind the devastation of broken dreams and shattered illusions, heading toward a future built on truth rather than pretense. And if Victoria cried herself to sleep that night, it wasn't from devastation, it was from relief, from release, from the freedom that came with finally accepting that some people would never see her value, no matter how she presented herself. The next morning, on Christmas Day, Victoria woke to find her father had left the morning newspapers outside her childhood bedroom door. Every major publication carried the same story. Morrison heiress reveals secret marriage, ends union after public humiliation. The articles detailed Daniel's fraud, Brittany's assault, the spectacular collapse of the merger, and the Hayes family's complete financial ruin. But Victoria barely glanced at them. She was too busy feeling her daughter kick, too focused on the future, too grateful for the family that had never stopped loving her, even when she'd pushed them away. 3 months later, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby girl named Grace Morrison Hayes, though the Hayes part would be legally removed before Grace's first birthday. Daniel signed away his parental rights without protest, too buried in legal troubles to fight for custody of a daughter he'd never wanted anyway. And if sometimes Victoria still thought about the man she'd married, about the promises he'd made and broken, she no longer felt devastated by his betrayal. Instead, she felt grateful. Grateful that she'd discovered his true nature before wasting another year, another decade, another lifetime on someone who'd never deserved her love in the first place. The Christmas party at the Ashford Hotel became legendary in New York social circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging people based on appearances, about the cost of cruelty, about the consequences of mistaking quiet strength for weakness. And whenever anyone asked Victoria about that night, she would smile softly and say only this: "I learned that devastation isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes you have to watch everything fall apart before you can rebuild something better." Her daughter Grace would grow up strong and sure, knowing her worth from birth, raised by a mother who'd learned the hard way that true value comes from within, that love should never require you to diminish yourself, and that sometimes the greatest gift life can give you is the clarity that comes from having everything stripped away. And on quiet nights, when Grace was asleep and the city lights twinkled outside her window, Victoria would think about that Christmas Eve and smile, not because she'd won, but because she'd survived, learned, and emerged stronger than before. That, she decided, was the real victory. 5 years later, the Morrison Foundation's annual Christmas Gala had become New York's most anticipated charitable event, but not for the reasons most people expected. While other galas flaunted excess and exclusivity, Victoria Morrison's foundation focused on substance over spectacle, raising hundreds of millions for educational programs in underserved communities while maintaining an atmosphere of genuine warmth rather than performative philanthropy. Victoria stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, watching her 5-year-old daughter Grace twirl across the marble floor in a simple red velvet dress, laughing as she danced with her grandfather. The little girl had James Morrison's sharp intelligence and Victoria's kind heart, but she possessed something neither of them had managed at her age, an unshakable confidence in her own worth that came from being raised with both truth and love. "Mommy, look!" Grace called out, executing a wobbly pirouette that made James beam with grandfatherly pride. "Grandpa taught me to spin." Victoria smiled, her heart swelling with an emotion she'd once thought she'd never feel again after that devastating Christmas 5 years ago. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The past 5 years had transformed her in ways she couldn't have imagined that snowy night when her marriage had imploded so spectacularly. She'd returned to teaching, but on her own terms, establishing a network of private schools that provided Ivy League-level education completely free to students from low-income families. She'd reconnected with her parents, building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than rebellion or obligation. And she'd learned that the opposite of devastation wasn't triumph, it was peace. Victoria Morrison? A hesitant voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a woman in her early 40s, elegant in a navy gown that screamed old money, but her expression carried genuine nervousness rather than the usual social calculation. Victoria recognized her immediately, Catherine Ashford, owner of the hotel where her marriage had ended so publicly. "Mrs. Ashford," Victoria said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for hosting us tonight. The ballroom looks magnificent." Catherine shook her hand, relief flooding her features. "I wanted to apologize, actually, for that night 5 years ago. I was the event coordinator, and I should have intervened when things got out of hand. I should have stopped what was happening to you, but I was worried about offending the Hayes family's business connections. I've regretted my cowardice ever since." Victoria studied the woman's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than the opportunistic apologies she'd received from countless social climbers over the years. "You weren't responsible for other people's cruelty, Mrs. Ashford, but I appreciate the apology nonetheless." "I've followed your foundation's work," Catherine continued. "My daughter attended one of your scholarship programs last year. She's at Columbia now, studying engineering. Without your schools, she never would have had that opportunity. So I wanted to say thank you and to tell you that what happened to you that night, it changed how I run my business. I don't allow people to use my venues for public humiliation anymore, regardless of how much money they're spending." Before Victoria could respond, a small commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted reluctantly, revealing a figure Victoria hadn't seen in 5 years. Daniel Hayes, looking far older than his 38 years, his once confident bearing replaced by the hunched shoulders of a broken man. The ballroom fell silent as people recognized him. Victoria felt her father tense across the room, saw hotel security moving subtly into position, but she raised a hand to stop them. Grace had noticed the sudden quiet and pressed against her grandfather's leg, her child's intuition sensing adult tension. Daniel approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. He wore an off-the-rack suit that Victoria recognized from a department store sale, his shoes scuffed, his face etched with lines that spoke of hard years and harder lessons. This wasn't the arrogant man who'd humiliated her at a Christmas party. This was someone else entirely. "I don't expect you to speak to me," Daniel said quietly, his voice lacking the smooth charm she remembered. "I don't deserve that courtesy, but I've been trying to get the courage to do this for 3 years, and I finally realized that if I didn't do it now, I never would." Victoria remained silent, watching him with the calm detachment she'd cultivated through years of therapy and healing. She felt no anger toward this man anymore, no hurt, only a mild curiosity about what could have brought him here. "I spent 2 years in federal prison for the fraud charges," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the shame in his eyes. "Another year in court-mandated therapy. I lost everything, my business, my family's respect, any chance at the career I'd spent my life building. Brittany left me before the trial even started, of course. She married a hedge fund manager 6 months later." He paused, his eyes drifting to where Grace stood with her grandfather, both of them watching him with identical expressions of protective wariness. Is that her? Our daughter?" "My daughter," Victoria corrected gently but firmly. "You signed away your rights, remember? Grace doesn't know you exist, and I'd prefer to keep it that way, unless you have a compelling reason why she should." Daniel flinched at the words, but nodded. "You're right. I have no claim to her. I just wanted to see her, to know that she's happy and healthy. She looks like you, beautiful and strong." "Why are you here, Daniel?" Victoria asked, not unkindly but with clear boundaries. "This is a charity gala. I'm assuming you didn't pay the $50,000 entry fee?" "I work here," Daniel said, and Victoria saw genuine humility in his expression for the first time ever. "I'm the assistant night manager. Started as a janitor 3 years ago, worked my way up. Mrs. Ashford gave me a chance when no one else would hire me, and I've been trying to prove I deserve it ever since." Catherine Ashford had quietly appeared at Victoria's side. He's been an excellent employee, she said softly, hard-working, honest, humble. When I learned about his past, I almost fired him, but he was upfront about everything. He's never asked for special treatment or tried to trade on his former connections. He just works, quietly and diligently, and he's genuinely tried to become a better person. Victoria looked at Daniel with new eyes, seeing past the ruins of the man she'd married to someone who'd actually faced his failures and tried to change. It didn't erase what he'd done, didn't repair the damage he'd caused, but it suggested that devastation had taught him what prosperity never could. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness, Daniel said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. I don't deserve that, and I'm not sure I ever will. I came to say that I was wrong about everything, about you, about what mattered, about what success actually means. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too stupid and greedy to recognize its value. And I'm sorry. Not because I want anything from you. I know that ship sailed 5 years ago, but because you deserved to hear it. You deserved a lot of things I never gave you. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, the last residual weight of that Christmas night finally lifting. She'd thought she'd forgiven Daniel years ago, but she realized now that true forgiveness required acknowledging growth, recognizing that people could change even if they couldn't undo their mistakes. Thank you for saying that, she said finally. I appreciate the apology, and I'm glad you're rebuilding your life with integrity. That takes courage. I saw what you did with the settlement money, Daniel continued. The prenuptial agreement said you could take everything, but you only took what was needed to cover my debts and legal fees. You could have destroyed me completely the way I tried to destroy you, but you chose mercy instead. That's when I finally understood the difference between us. You had real wealth, the kind that money can't buy, and I was too blind to see it. Grace had grown bored with the adult conversation and tugged on Victoria's hand. Mommy, can we do the cake cutting soon? You promised I could help with the special announcement. Victoria smiled down at her daughter, this miraculous little human who'd been born from devastation and raised in love, who would grow up knowing her worth because her mother had learned to know hers. In just a few minutes, sweetheart, go dance with Grandpa one more time, okay? As Grace skipped away, Victoria turned back to Daniel. I hope you find happiness, Daniel. Real happiness, not the kind that comes from status or money or other people's approval. The kind that comes from knowing who you are and being content with that person. I hope so too, Daniel said quietly, and I hope Grace grows up knowing how lucky she is to have you as her mother. I hope she never takes that for granted the way I took you for granted. He turned to leave, but Victoria called after him. Daniel, for what it's worth, I don't regret marrying you. You taught me important lessons about myself, about love, about the difference between what I thought I wanted and what I actually needed. Those lessons were painful, but they were valuable. So thank you for that, at least. Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You're a better person than I ever deserved, Victoria. I hope someday I can be half as good as you always were. He disappeared into the crowd, returning to whatever duties he had as assistant night manager, and Victoria watched him go with something close to peace. The man who devastated her 5 years ago no longer existed. He'd been broken down and rebuilt into someone humbler, wiser, diminished in worldly terms, but perhaps enriched in ways that actually mattered. James Morrison appeared at her side, Grace riding on his shoulders like a conquering princess. Are you all right, sweetheart? I was ready to have security remove him, but you seemed to want to handle it yourself. I'm fine, Dad, Victoria assured him, reaching up to squeeze her daughter's small hand. Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm grateful. Grateful? Her father's eyebrows rose in surprise. Grateful that I get to build Grace's life on truth instead of deception. Grateful that she'll grow up knowing her worth without having to test it against people who can't see it. grateful that I learned these lessons now instead of wasting decades on the wrong path. Victoria smiled up at her daughter, and grateful that the worst night of my life led me to the best years of my life. The evening continued with speeches and dancing, with the announcement that the Morrison Foundation had raised $200 million for educational programs, with Grace's delighted participation in cutting a massive cake shaped like a stack of books. Victoria watched it all with contentment, surrounded by people who valued substance over surface, who measured success in lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep in the car ride home and Victoria had tucked her into bed, she stood in her daughter's doorway watching the little girl sleep. Grace clutched a stuffed elephant, a gift from her grandfather, and smiled in her dreams, utterly secure in her place in the world. Victoria thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, standing in a different ballroom with dirty water dripping down her dress and divorce papers in her shaking hands. That woman had thought she was being devastated, destroyed, publicly humiliated beyond recovery. But devastation, Victoria had learned, was just another word for transformation. Everything had to fall apart so it could be rebuilt stronger, truer, more authentic. The marriage had to end so the real relationship, the one between a mother and daughter, between a woman and her family, between someone lost and the person they were meant to become, could begin. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Grace was absolutely radiant tonight. "So were you, darling. Your father and I are so proud of the woman you've become, the mother you are, the difference you're making. Love you endlessly." Victoria typed back a simple response. "Love you too. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself." She thought about Daniel working the night shift at the Ashford Hotel, rebuilding his life one honest day at a time. She thought about Brittany, who'd apparently cycled through 3 marriages in 5 years, still chasing wealth and status and finding neither happiness nor peace. She thought about the Hayes family, scattered and diminished, learning too late that cruelty carries a cost that compounds over time. But mostly she thought about Grace, this miracle child who'd been conceived in a dying marriage, but born into unconditional love, who would grow up strong and sure, who would change the world not because she came from wealth, but because she'd been raised with values that transcended it. "Thank you," Victoria whispered into the quiet room, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking, God, fate, the universe, or simply the mysterious forces that soon turn devastation into redemption. "Thank you for breaking me down so I could build myself back up. Thank you for showing me what I was worth when I'd forgotten. Thank you for grace, and for second chances, and for the wisdom that comes from surviving things you thought would destroy you." Outside, snow began to fall over Manhattan, blanketing the city in white just as it had 5 years ago. But this time Victoria watched it with joy rather than tears, with hope rather than despair, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been devastated and discovered that she was stronger than the forces that tried to break her. The Christmas party that had ended her marriage had also freed her to become the woman she was meant to be, not defined by her husband's approval or society's judgment, but by her own values, her own choices, her own understanding of what truly mattered. And as Victoria finally climbed into her own bed, exhausted but content, she smiled at the thought that the greatest revenge against those who tried to devastate her wasn't their financial ruin or social disgrace. It was her own happiness, her own success, her own peace. Because in the end, the best response to cruelty wasn't retaliation, but transformation. Not vengeance, but victory over the parts of yourself that had allowed the cruelty in the first place. She'd been devastated 5 years ago, but she'd also been reborn. And that, Victoria Morrison decided, as she drifted off to sleep, made all the difference.